Welcome to California ReLeaf's educational webinar. We are pleased that you could join us today. My name is Megan Duquette. I'm California ReLeaf's Education and Communications Program Manager. And before we get started, I wanted to share just a little bit about California ReLeaf for those of you that may not be familiar with our organization. California ReLeaf is a statewide nonprofit, and we're dedicated to supporting grassroots efforts and building strategic partnerships that protect, enhance, and grow California's urban and community forests. And we have four main program areas that help us complete and fulfill our mission. We do that through our network. We have a network of over 85 urban tree nonprofits and urban greening community-based organizations throughout the state. And we convene this awesome network for peer-to-peer learning opportunities throughout the year through webinars and conferences and that kind of thing. We provide pass-through grants as an organization. We provide pass-through grants to local groups to engage communities, provide jobs, and plant and care for trees in their community. We do advocacy. We speak for trees at the state legislation, and we provide resources for community groups to speak for trees locally. And then last but not least, we provide educational programs like the webinar that we're doing today, as well as sharing research and resources on our website and through our e-newsletter and social media channels. We invite you to learn more about California ReLeaf by visiting our website, californiareleaf.org, and I'll put that in the chat in just a few minutes. And we invite you to stay in touch with us either on social media or via our e-newsletter. And now that you know a little bit more about California ReLeaf, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. And the first is that we will be recording today's webinar, and we will email it to all of the folks that are joining us on the call today, and those of you that have registered. We will send that to you later this week, so stay tuned for that. We will also post it on our YouTube and our website later this week. The next item that we ask you to do is please stay muted throughout the presentation. That way we aren't distracting from our presenters today. And later in the program, we're going to have a designated question and answer time period at the end. So we ask that you can please put your questions in the chat as we go. We'll monitor those, or you can hold those during the Q&A period at the end. And you can also ask questions by raising your hand at the bottom of the Zoom toolbars. You'll see that option, and that will virtually put your hand up, and then we'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and ask your questions. And now I have the wonderful privilege of introducing you to our speakers or presenters today. We have Igor Laćan, who is with the University of California Cooperative Extension. He's the advisor for the San Francisco Bay Area, specializing in urban forestry. He also serves on California ReLeaf's board of directors. He is our board secretary. His work with the UC Cooperative Extension program focuses on urban trees and water, research projects on emerging issues in the urban landscape. And our second presenter today is Kurt Peacock. Kurt Peacock has been involved in the plant and tree business for 45 years as a nurseryman, a consultant, and an educator. He received his BS in agricultural science from Fresno State and has been an ISA certified arborist for 18 years. He currently works as a consultant, founding Peacock Consulting in 2006. He also is a senior arborist and project manager for the last 8 years at Tree San Diego, overseeing the planting and distribution of 9,500 trees to date, as well as heading Tree San Diego's Tree Stewards and Trajectory program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Igor as our first presenter. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us today. And I'll stop sharing my presentation slide deck, and you're free to do that now. Thank you.
All right. I just have to find the button. The button, here we go. Screen number one. Screen number one. Screen number one. There we go. How's that?
Gotcha.
Okay, so I'm going to try to be very, very quick and turn it over to Kurt as soon as I can, because I think Kurt has practical experience to share with all of us in Northern California who are just getting started with this. I want to point out that everything good in this presentation comes from my colleagues who are with the Shothole Borer Research Program, and that's Dr. Bano Berman, Dr. John Kabashima, and Randall Oliver. And their website, which you should bookmark and become very familiar with, is ishb.org. Again, that website again, ishb.org. And we'll talk a lot more about it because that's where all of your resources are. So rather than trying to invent something, simply go to ishb.org and you can pull up all of the information you might need from management, monitoring, to actual materials for residents or professional arborists. So this is really your main first stop and your main stop. And it's one of my big goals for this talk to introduce the website. So we'll briefly talk about biology and the effects of invasive shothole borers, and Kurt will tell us more from his experience in Southern California. We'll talk about the management options, and we'll talk about some of the planning and management considerations. Now, I understand that a lot of us on the call are with non-governmental organizations, so I try to highlight those things that I think apply best to non-governmental organizations. But because we have a variety of audience types on this webinar, I left in the information for professional arborists as well. And then we'll have some time for discussion after Kurt's presentation. Now, my goal here is really for everybody to get a sense of what this pest does and how to recognize it, to get some sense of what the management options are, even if you yourselves are not going to be doing the management, to have an idea of what is out there, what is possible. And then, very importantly, to have a reasonably good overview of that ishb.org website. What you will need to do is spend some quality time with the ishb.org website, and I would budget at least 30 minutes because there's a bunch of videos there that describe the problem, describe the management. Again, there's no better repository of information than the website. Now, if you are engaged in management, and really this first point is for everybody. If you are engaged with management, I think the second step is you will need to decide on the management options you can accept. And we'll talk briefly about that, but in essence, if you're not going to use chemical treatments, insecticides and fungicides, then that's something you should recognize as soon as possible and look at what those other management options look like. The other thing you need to think about is where the funding for this is going to come from, and especially important, funding for replanting. Now, I know a lot of you are engaged in tree planting, and this pest doesn't really change what you do, except that you might want to shift away from some of the reproductive hosts that are badly affected by this pest, and we'll talk about that in a minute, to other trees. And the good news here is that some of those reproductive hosts are actually very common in our urban forests already. Now, how's that good news? You're like, no, dude, that's bad news. That means a lot of trees can be affected. That's true, but it also means that we have an option, we have a chance here to diversify our urban tree assemblages into species that are not so common. And again, some other goals that you will need to follow up with. If you are going to do monitoring and trapping, then that's something you'll need to set up. The website will guide you on how to do that. And finally, just for everyone, what we're talking about here is the usual pest management cycle: monitor, manage, or remove a tree, monitor again to see how your management actions are affecting the pest, and then of course replant. And I really want to stress replant because you can't roll back time. So if we lose trees, we want to replant them right away rather than wait for, some other better day kind of thing, because we can never bring back those years while the tree could be growing. And I'm going to start kind of from the back. I will start with lessons learned from John Kabashima, who's been boring me with this stuff for over 10 years now. And you see the boring, that's a double entendre there. Yeah. John's point is that monitoring is key to being able to catch the amplifier trees, which are trees that are producing a lot of these beetles. Okay, you can do two things. You can do visual monitoring, which is exactly what it sounds like, or you can do trapping. We're not going to focus on trapping here because, again, I think my audience is mostly non-governmental organizations. Just a reminder that both methods can be very effective. So you don't have to use trapping. You can use it, it can be very effective, but you can also use visual monitoring. So I would like you to maybe begin today to learn to recognize these insects. And then the second lesson is that you should try to find the amplifier trees and remove them. They're not going to recover, but they're going to just pump out these beetles. Now, again, the rest of the lessons are for professional arborists. If you have low, medium severity infestations and you're willing to accept chemical management, then there are effective combinations of insecticides and fungicides which can be used. And if you have a good monitoring program, then it's okay to only treat the trees that are infested, which is a little bit different from some of our usual IPM suggestions. We're not going to preventatively treat trees. We're going to monitor them, and if they become infested, then we'll treat them. And then the final point is especially important for climbing arborists. So if you have anybody who's climbing these infested trees, Botryospheric canker, which is a fungal disease, and these borers seem to go together. They like each other. And Botryospheric can weaken individual limbs and branches. So if you have a tree and you notice that it has canker and it has the borers, number one, remove those limbs or branches that have the canker, but also do not tie into them. If you're climbing, there have been injuries in Southern California from arborists falling out of trees when those branches broke. So now that I kind of confused you with the ending part, let's step through this, and I think you'll see how we got to these lessons. What are we talking about? We're talking about a combination of a beetle and a fungus, and the $10,000 word of the day that describes that is pathosystem. So you've got a vector, which is the beetle, that carries a disease, which is a fungus, and they carry the fungus because they eat these fungi. They're actually mushroom farmers. They're tiny. They're less than 2 millimeters long, and there's two of them. We call them invasive shothole borers. If you've been around long enough, you may have heard the term polyphagous shothole borer, which is this guy. But then they discovered that there's another one, Kuroshio shothole borer. They look exactly the same. You can't tell them apart just by looking at them. And for our purposes, they do the same thing, which is they invade trees, they infest them with the fungus, and then the tree declines. So where did they come from? Where did they get here? Well, they probably came in packing materials, in wooden packing materials, and they came from Southeast Asia. Where are they now? Well, thank you for asking. You can see the current distribution where now? At the ISHB.org website, which, by the way, the website will redirect you to this address, but it's easier to remember to just remember ISHB.org, and you'll see a distribution of the map down here in the Los Angeles area, going all the way down to San Diego, and unfortunately now in San Jose as well. And you can zoom in to the map if you want to. This is what they look like, as usual, on the penny. Biologists always use penny as a reference because they don't have any money. So, you need something as a reference. I'm waiting for somebody to use like a gold coin, and it's just not happening. So you can see the female and the male. The female is bigger, and she is able to disperse, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The male is smaller, and he does not leave the gallery, and you can see the galleries out here. So this is an important point of recognition. These are what are called ambrosia beetles. They eat the fungus, but it also means that they bore directly into the tree. They don't just stay under the bark like bark beetles. These guys bore into the tree. So you can see that, you can see how the gallery extends into the tree. And you can also see what the fungus does. You can see that area of brown discoloration of the fungus. On larger trees, it looks something like this. And again, notice the galleries extend into the trunk. They don't just stay under the bark. It looks a little bit different in trunk and branches, and just a reminder again, this can cause the branches to break. So again, if you're doing work in the tree, you need to put in extra care if you're going to actually send climbers into the tree. So how does this insect actually work? What is its life cycle? Well, this is what it does. Now, how we get to this is kind of like this. We start with female beetles, there they are, attacking a healthy host tree. And as I mentioned, the attack proceeds by a beetle landing on the bark and immediately burrowing into the tree, making a gallery which they line with the fungus they brought with them. They bring the fungus with them. They have special organs kind of at the back of their head in which they bring fungal spores. So that's the tunnel. You're looking head on into the tunnel, and you can see the fungi growing on the tunnel. Now, in the tunnel, you see the developing larvae. So the female laid eggs, the eggs hatched into these larvae, and they are eating the fungus, and they're happily mating with their siblings. Now, that's not only disgusting, it's also an important evolutionary advantage for this beetle, because it means when the female leaves the gallery, she is ready to lay eggs. She does not need to find a mate or something like that. She is ready to lay eggs, make new tunnels. That's important because it knocks out one of our management tools, which is mating disruption systems, which we have for some other pests. That's not going to work here because she doesn't need to mate. She's ready to lay eggs. So what they prefer to do, and this is sort of the good news, they prefer to stay on the same tree. They prefer not to leave. And they're going to keep doing this, and this is really where that damage from the fungus starts to add up. So you see this cumulative damage over time as the fungus spreads through the tree and destroys both the cambium and the water conducting tissues of the tree. So at some point, the tree begins to decline. By the way, when you see this stage, this is sort of bad news for that tree. Trees generally seem to not recover when they're in this die-back stage, which means the branches are actually dying back. As that tree is close to death, that's the point at which the beetles start leaving. Right? So they prefer not to leave. Right? That's an important point for management. When you see a tree that's badly infested, most of the beetles are still on that tree. They're just beginning to leave the tree. And this brings us to the concept of amplifier trees. It seems as though in any one landscape, there will be one or two or a few individual trees that are really badly infested. And those trees are just pumping out generation after generation of the beetles. They're not going to recover. Those trees are essentially dying year over year. But during that time, they're going to continue to pump out beetles, which will then spread to the other trees. So a good idea is to find these few individual trees and remove them. They're not going to recover anyway. And this way you have removed a major source of the beetle. Okay? And then, of course, what do you want to do after you remove that tree? You want to replant it. Again, please, replant. It's part of the management of this pest. You don't replant with the same species, but replant. So now let's talk about, well, which species should we be concerned about? And this gets a little complicated, but not too complicated. Basically, the beetle showed up, one of the first places where the beetle showed up was the Huntington Botanical Gardens. I don't know if you've been. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. What this did for us is that it gave us a pretty good indication of which species the beetle could attack because they've got everything. It's an arboretum, right? So it turned out that they can attack a lot of tree species, something like almost 250. But most of those, they will not be able to complete their life cycle in. They can't actually lay eggs, the larvae won't develop, something's not quite right. So instead, we found that only about 78 species of trees, now it's not only, but it's fewer than 250, only about 78 species of trees support reproduction, and we call those reproductive hosts. And then it turns out that of those reproductive hosts, there's a small number, about 17, that are usually badly injured or killed. So I would focus on that list of 17. And on the website, you will find that list in this PDF. And that's what I would focus on. Now, some of these, unfortunately, are fairly common urban trees. We got sycamores, we got London planes, we got maples, we got liquid ambers, right? These are all fairly common urban trees. There are some things that are not so common. Some of the poplars are not that common as street trees. Unfortunately, oaks, some of the oaks are. Valley oak, especially in English oak. So this is what you should focus on. These are the hosts that are going to be attacked first, and these are hosts that are going to be hit the hardest. In Southern California, box elder has been one of the first trees to get attacked and one of the trees that produces the most beetles. I don't know if the same will be in Northern California, but from what we've seen, yeah, it'd probably be, likely to go this way as well. So again, if you're engaged in tree planting, you probably want to try to shift away from these 17 species. Right? That's it. It's not don't plant or don't, never plant these. That's not the point. The point is if you already have a bunch and they're getting damaged, shift away from these 17. So what are you looking for when you're in the field? Well, you're looking for tiny little holes. This is a mandatory symptom of this disease. These are beetles. They make holes. If you don't have holes, you don't have this beetle. You have something else. And you can use your cheap ballpoint pen, right? No fine writing instruments here. We're talking about cheap ballpoint pen to use as a point of reference, right? It'll be a little bit smaller than the tip of a medium ballpoint pen. In many trees, you end up with this profuse gumming or bleeding, but again, it's bleeding out of distinct little holes, right? There are some lookalikes, and the website will step you through the process of telling lookalikes from ISHB. Okay. And then you're going to count the holes. Now, if you're a biologist or an ecologist, you do a lot of counting. That's what we do. And you're going to be counting the holes. And if you have fewer than 50, you have low infestation. If you have more than 150, this is on a single tree, and branch dieback, then you have severe infestation, in which case there's going to be no recovery. And again, in between is moderate and heavy infestation levels. And this is what it looks like on a sycamore. This does look a little different on different tree species. And again, the website will show you images of what different tree species look like when they're attacked. Okay, but in general, you're looking for tiny holes, lots of them, and on most trees, some bleeding or gumming. And this is, again, you go from low infestation, moderate, heavy, severe, which includes both heavy infestation and dieback of the branches. And do look up, because the beetles not only affect the trunk, but they also affect the large branches. And in some tree species, they primarily affect large branches. For example, in some oaks, they will primarily hit the large branches. What are our control options? Well, there's really two classes of control. There's the cultural control or sanitation, which consists of removing either the infested trees or the infested branches if it's one of the species where the insect affects the branches and not the trunk. And again, the website will tell you what those species are. And chemical control. Chemical control is a combination of insecticide to kill the beetle and fungicide to arrest the growth of the fungus. Those are typically applied either as trunk sprays or as injections into the tree or into the soil. And they are effective, but you want to apply them before you get to the severe stage, because at that point, the tree just doesn't have enough water moving through to actually translocate those pesticides effectively. Right? It's not cheap. And it's really not an option for natural areas, right? For natural areas, you're really looking at this sanitation option. And by the way, there are matrices websites that'll tell you how to do this or which options you have open to you, given that whether a tree is a reproductive host or not, and then considering whether a tree can fall onto something or it's in a wildland area in a large park where the risk is low. So you can step through these matrices and get a sense of what to do. So I want to finish up with a couple of things. One is wood management. You have to do something with the wood after you remove that tree, and the beetles will continue to emerge from that wood until it dries out. And so you shouldn't just leave these large trunks laying around. Once the beetle is established in an area, it's less important, but especially now initially, in the initial stages of infestation, you want to somehow manage that wood. The best thing to do is to chip the wood to about 1 inch or smaller. Some of the tub grinding machines will do that for you, and that'll give you 99% kill. If you're okay with 98% kill, then just about any chipping machine, any chipper will grind it down to 3 inches, chips down 3 inches, and that'll give you 98% kill. Now, if you then compost the chips, or if you solarize them, and there's instructions on the website on how to solarize them, then you're going to end up with complete kill. Right? The one little rub, especially for natural areas, is that beetles will continue to emerge from stumps. So in urban areas, we usually grind out stumps, which in this case helps a lot. In natural areas, if you can grind out the stumps, do it. Because again, the beetles will continue to emerge from that stump. And then if you have large pieces of wood, you really have a couple of options. One is to solarize on site. If you are in sunny Southern California, this can take a couple of months. Or if you're in Livermore and Sacramento, if you're in Half Moon Bay, it'll take like years. I mean, it's just not going to happen. It's okay. The beetles will eventually stop emerging because they're no longer reproducing. But it's just consider your climate. Does it actually get hot enough to cook them, or is it just going to sit there forever? The big point, and something that everybody should be aware of, is to not move large pieces of wood uncovered. And I see this all the time, where somebody removes a tree, piles the wood in some kind of a pickup truck, and just drives it around. This is how, almost certainly, how we got this beetle here. Because somebody moved large pieces of infested wood around. Don't do that. It's better to leave it on site, even, than to put in a truck and move it somewhere else. So chip, solarize, compost, or at the very least cover the load if you're moving around. What are your resources? Well, I mentioned the ISHB website. There's handouts. They call this primary resources. There's webinar recordings. There's videos on how to do just about any of this, including how to manage wood. I think you should budget 1 to 2 hours, but budget at least 30 minutes. Look through the website if you're not going to go through everything they have on there, and there's a lot of material, so I would see how you might not want to get it all in one gulp. At least get familiar with what's there and download the pest note, and I have the PDF link in this presentation, so you have all of this info in one place. Have it with you when you're print it out, have it with you in the field. Your other option is to do an e-extension online course. It's free. You have to register with that system. That's also free. And that takes about an hour, and you will learn everything you need to know about these pests. It's meant for UC Master Gardeners, but it's great for anybody. To identify the insects, you basically have 2 options. The ultimate identification, especially if it involves DNA work, will go to the California Department of Food and Agriculture. But rather than contacting them directly, I think you can contact your county agricultural commissioner's office for help. And in the Bay Area, all of our ag commissioner's offices are well aware of this problem, and they will help you out. The nice thing about this is because the beetle and the fungus are so tightly coupled, you don't actually need a beetle to identify this problem. If you have fungus-infested wood, the CDFA lab is able to identify the fungus, and then they can just tell you, yeah, it's the quote-unquote right fungus, it's the right species of Fusarium, you have ISHB, or they can say, no, this is something else, you don't have the problem. Again, go through your ag commissioner's office, and they will guide you on how to take the samples, although there's instructions on the website as well. And finally, we at UC Cooperative Extension are ready to help out as well, and our colleagues at UC Davis are as well. So that's all I got, and my email is over there, but I will turn over to Kurt for some first-hand experiences. This pest has been in Southern California for 10 years, and arborists like Kurt have dealt with it for 10 years. So, Kurt, take it away.
Oh, well, thank you, Igor, and big shout out to the extension and everybody there, John, and all these people who have helped make me such a smarter arborist and keep us up to date on the latest thing that lands here and starts doing what this pest did. And the way I got introduced to it was in 2015, I took a medical leave to have a body part replaced. I was out about 8 or 10 weeks. And at the time, I was working part-time for a tree care company because I wanted to learn more about commercial tree care. So this company stored its trucks down in the Tijuana River Valley because the land down there is cheap and, it doesn't cost as much. So I went to go down to this area we called the shop. And normally when you drive down Hollister Avenue, you are greeted once you hit the river valley with a huge, green scene because all that moisture there. Well, I drove and I got to the bridge and I looked around, and on the website, ISB website, the very first photo they have is from the Tijuana River Valley. I couldn't find that in my collection, but that's what I looked out and saw. I was like, what happened to all the green? And then trees that were up were down. And a colleague of mine, I asked him, I said, what's going on here? And he says, it's in about the last 3.5 months. We started to notice them dying. It was longer than that. And then they all started falling over. They literally lost all that cover. So I went and contacted my UC Extension IPM website and found out, aha, we got another interloper here. And original estimates, I think, were in that valley that some close to perhaps tens of thousands of the willows were being affected. I thought I heard at one point it might have been like 100,000. Yeah, thank you, Igor. And the decimation was just, I was like, oh my God, where's all this cover coming from? And then I thought, as we see these invasive pests, that, oh man, we got another bubonic plague, that's going to destroy everything. And it was dismal for a very long while. He's got some recovery photos. And then Megan has a couple that I literally just took on Monday of the area to show you that, what looked like Armageddon in 2015. There's a dead sentinel tree standing right in front of you there. That's where the river goes, right underneath that bridge. But you'll notice to the right, we've got greenery. And then the next photo looks out. There's 2 more I think I sent her. Yeah, look at that. I mean, just from Armageddon back to green, it's been 10 years. And what I was going to do, but against better advice because of our Tijuana River sewage collection problem, we really don't want to go tromping around in that open space, because now it's the big thing some of you may or may not heard of. It's a hydrogen sulfide stink. It's very unpleasant down there. But there was enormous regrowth of willows, and then some that were to the ground. I mean, we've got 30 footers after 9 years, and then an enormous amount of castor bean in that area, an enormous amount. And from where I looked, there was no sign that I could see in my little brief 1/4 mile walk of any new signs of ISB infestation. So the recovery there has been amazing. But to do the timeline, that was 2015 and it's September. And then we heard about it. We knew they really couldn't go in and do a bunch of clearing and grinding of stumps, of course, because it's a very wild area. You can't get the equipment down there to do a bunch of effective management. And then it was about 2 years later that we noticed, or there was a report that it had gone out to the east part of San Diego County in an area called Flynn Springs County Park. And a consulting arborist colleague of mine was called out there because, they noticed this strange stuff dripping, out of the sap was coming out of these trees. And it turned out there was a sycamore, several sycamores, I believe, and poplars that were massively infested and oozing. But it was kind of interesting because that's at least a 20 mile difference. And in between, we really didn't see any, I'll call it hopscotching. But what I've also noticed, and Igor and I talked about this insect really likes the riparian habitat. Big dried out areas, even with treescapes or not, don't seem to be, suitable for them to support their life. So one other thing to pass along to everybody, if you do manage trees and you do have a water source, be it lake, pond, or otherwise, keep your eyes on the perimeter, because that, if it's going to show, is likely where they're going to be, heavily dependent upon that water source. So at Flint Springs County Park, they reacted really quickly and they took down the amplifier trees in very short order, ground up everything. I don't know if they solarized in place or not, but they were able to basically kind of snuff out that little flare up. And I think there might have been another tree or two over the next year or two that showed signs, but they'd pounced on it enough so they kind of rubbed it out. And then it was 2019, I think so, in Balboa Park, San Diego's crown jewel, as it were. A colleague of mine was at the time one of the horticulturists and arborists, and she said, we found the ISB, and it was on a coast live oak. And it was a little canyon where they had planted a group of trees. Well, it was that one oak, and again, they pounced on it really fast, ground that thing out of there. And there was, I believe, a few strikes on another tree, but they were able to kind of put up the fire before it, took off and got into the park. Although large swaths of that park are actually, other than turf irrigation, kind of dry. It was a little infestation that landed, but with quick action so far, they've been able to knock it down. And I don't think I've had a report from either or any of the arborists and staff out of Balboa Park that they've seen any new damage. And they have tons of host trees. And the one thing that I wanted to, Igor touched upon, that's really, really interesting is, San Diego and Los Angeles County, I guess, have the most tree species in the state as far as variety goes, and the count's over 640, I think, for San Diego. And I think that's going to be one of those keys, is that, yeah, as Igor said, you took out a sycamore that died from it. Well, don't go grab a sycamore. Don't stay away from those host trees. And there are trees from all over this planet that that we have as a tree palette here that other places can only envy. So I think our diversity is also why it has been just kind of a little isolated here and there. And granted, the thing has moved and hopscotched its way up the coast, or either that. I kind of think by the way it spread in Los Angeles County is they got their own whole shipment of stuff, and because it spread to a much wider area much more quickly. Like I said, in San Diego County, literally right down by the borders where that river valley is. And then there was this kind of delay. We knew they were there, and then it was just a couple of little outbreaks. And then they started finding it all over Orange County. And I just couldn't fathom that it was our population that moved and took hold there. Maybe. But another thing, Igor said, the Huntington Garden. I had a colleague say that he went there a few years ago and he was depressed because of the amount between gold-spotted oak borer and the shothole borer, how many mature trees they took out of that landscape. They had to. And so they lost a bunch of those big anchor trees in that garden. He said, yeah, it's kind of a shell of its former self. So coming back, and as I said, you stay away from especially box elder. That's thing's got a bullseye on it. I wouldn't plant one for all the money in the world because it is just so susceptible, and took out huge stands of them. And that, it's your eyes and your ears. I've had people call me out as a consultant because I think Igor had one too. Somebody that swore they had this insect. And in one case, it was a sycamore tree, primary host, but the sycamore also has the sycamore borer, which is basically coexisted with that tree. And they thought that all the holes were, massive infestation. I had to explain, we pulled bark away, and that, no, this is the wrong thing. So you, take it with a grain of salt and go in if you have to do an analysis with your eyes open. But he's right, the telltale thing, at least from your diagnostic standpoint, that pinhole is the size of the end of a pin. You might have a candidate there. But a lot of other mimics and other holes and galleries and borers have caused some people to just kind of panic. And turned out that in a couple cases. And in my work with Tree San Diego, the good news is that I was telling them earlier, in our urban forest, the street trees are kind of dry and things are, it's not a huge riparian habitat. So I have yet to have any of the trees we have planted as Tree San Diego that I know of come down with it. And I also have noted that I don't think there's been a report of infestation in any nursery situation that I know of. So they're not going after nursery stock. You worry about taking something home that might have it. But if you just avoid those primary 17 species, just kind of take them off your planting list, you're not likely to have any kind of a problem with this pest, as long as, again, we still don't know enough about the biology of the insect. How much is stress the indicator? Because what looked like quote unquote perfectly healthy trees were massively attacked. And so the mechanism of that and its action is still something that we're more will be revealed. And I just hope we get a better handle on it before it spreads. But I also think one saving grace is, again, drier areas are probably not going to be as affected. I don't expect a huge amount of it in the San Joaquin Valley necessarily, because it kind of moved up the coast. And we will just have to see. Hopefully they can knock it out in San Jose before it spreads around the rest of the Bay Area. Time will tell. Anyway, that was just my little story about our experience here. And as I said, the regrowth in the Tijuana River Valley is phenomenal and very inspiring. And just because something is listed as a fatal host, as we all know in nature, not a whole population is going to be subject to fatality. So hopefully whatever strain is regrown or down in that river valley has got some resistance to the pest. And then my other cynic in me said that all the pollution we have down in the valley is, poisoned the trees. So the shothole borers left, years ago because it was too polluted and they moved on elsewhere. But don't think that's the case. And that's not much of a strategy for, of course, management of pests or anything, but just a note of observation. Anyway, that's all from me.
Well, thank you so much, Kurt, and thank you so much, Igor. We will now open our question and answer period. So if you have a question, you can either type that and put it in the chat now. We'll give you a minute. Or you can raise your hand and ask your questions verbally. There is a little button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar that says raise your hand. You can select that, and then we can call on you. There's a lot of information to absorb, so we'll give you a moment to think about your questions, and then feel free to put those in the chat for us.
I detect stunned silence. Okay.
Yes, we were so complete. No, nothing else needs to be said. That's of course not true. And then the other thing to point out about the website, there is the webinar they did in July. That is over 3 hours. So if you really want to deep dive, you can watch the entire thing and get schooled on by all those other knowledgeable folks too about what's going on with ISB currently.
We've got a couple questions. Yeah, in the chat. We've got. Do you want to address those?
George I'll take the first one. George is asking about the Huntington, and I don't actually know the details, but I know John Kabashima and the Cooperative Extension folks were involved in that. And I think really it's a combination of removals and treatments. But because it was one of the earlier infestations, I think it probably, there was a lot of learning, which is great for us. It wasn't so great for them because, as Kurt pointed out, they lost some trees. I don't know if you want to add anything, Kurt.
Yeah, no, I just heard that kind of secondhand because I haven't been to the Huntington in years.
Yeah.
Back there, but it was naked. To him it looked. They lost.
This was years ago, by the way, George. This was 10 years ago. So this was one of the early infestations. It was lucky. I don't want to say it was lucky in case somebody from the Huntington is on the call, but it was lucky in the sense that it gave us a really good experiment to try to figure out what the host range is. And there was an interesting question about solarization. And Sarah says, I heard a presentation on Mediterranean oak borer, and CAL FIRE indicated solarization was not recommended. So remember, this is a slightly different pest. Solarization is difficult to pull off. I mean, that's just a basic fact about solarization. It is not impossible. There is very good, guidance. And basically, solarization is going to work the same way for any insect pest. You're going to use clear plastic. You're going to put it over the pile. The smaller the pile, the shallower the pile of logs, and the better your plastic coverage is, and the hotter the place you're doing it at, the better the results. The problem with solarization, you can see this from materials that were published 30 years ago, is that it is, if you mess up, meaning like somebody lifts up the plastic, or an animal comes by and tears the plastic or something like that, that's not working, right? Like the insects are going to leave. So it is a good tool that's hard to use. The problem is that for a lot of these insects, our next tool is chipping, which may not be available at all to you if you are in a wildland area, or if you have really large logs that you can't fit into a chipper. And usually that's the combination that people have, actually, where you have a regional park or a state park and you have really big trees and they're really far away from any infrastructure. So then what do you do? Well, solarization is an option. Debarking might be another option, followed by solarization. But they're right, this is not the easiest thing to pull off. I don't know, Kurt, if you have any thoughts.
No, you spoke to it. It's the fact that a bunch of these things in the wildland areas, you can't get in the equipment you need to do to really do good chipping, especially of large material. And then the solarization, the only other comment was that mimic the people that do fumigation and use weighted bags to hold the plastic down, an absolute tight seal.
Oh, that's really good. That's right. That's really good, actually. Yeah. So yeah. Hope that's helpful. Let's go to Alex, who has his hand, and then we'll take Nara's question about volunteers and community members. Alex, speak up.
All right. Oh, there we go. Sorry,
there we go. Go.
I was trying to figure out how to unmute on mobile. I've never used this one before. So yeah, my question is about the oaks, which I think is like the biggest concern that I have for this pest. It seems like we have 2 oaks from the white oak group on this like super susceptible list. That's the valley oak and the English oak. And my question is, there are some trees that are not on the list, and I'm not sure if that's because they're just not prevalent in Southern California, or if it's because they're less susceptible. And I was kind of wondering about blue oak in particular, because that's a close relative of valley oak. So I might wonder if it's got a similar susceptibility. So I don't know if you can speak to that. I mean, should we be moving away from all of these, related white oak groups, or how should we handle that?
Okay, good. That's actually a good question to which I don't have an answer, so I'm just going to make it up, which is always an excellent way of answering technical questions. But the folks who develop these lists always stress that this is not an absolute prohibition. And Kurt pointed out a very important point, which is when you have this infestation in a natural area, the fact is when it doesn't wipe out 100% of a species, that means that there's some individual little willow out there that is not, for some reason, is not a good host. And you know what happens, right? This is natural selection in action. This is probably why 10 years after that mass die-off of willows, we have a bunch of willows. They're probably a little bit different genetically, right? Because they're descended from the willows that survived the initial attack. So I suspect for a lot of our wildland trees, that's what we're looking at in the long term. I don't think blue oaks was on the list of 17, and I think frankly it would be by now if it were so susceptible. I think it's been a long enough time where it probably would have made it onto the list if it were really, really badly affected. On the other hand, we rarely use blue oaks, at least in Northern California, as street trees. So, Kurt.
For us here in Southern California, blue oak's wonderful, and Igor's right. The thing is massive spreading. It's the biggest of all oaks, apparently, globally. It's the big dude of them all. And then for us here in San Diego County, its range is restricted above 3,000, actually above 4,000 to 6,000 feet. So it's a narrow band of the Cuyamacas and Palomar Mountain where they grow. And a whole bunch of those species brought to our elevation are just poor performers. They just, they don't adapt well. So it hasn't been hit a lot. And then the compounding thing for us here in San Diego County is we, of course, were also the site of GSOB, the gold spotted oak borer. That one has done major damage to Engelmann and Coast Live oak here to the tune of 80 to probably upwards of 80 or 90,000 trees now. So bad enough one pest picking on them, and we got a double whammy. But I don't know that other than in the Balboa Park, where it was a Coast Live oak that was first attacked, I don't know of any big stands that have suffered invasion and attack here in San Diego County to date, anyway.
I think this Kurt's point, just for everybody, is going to be super important, which is the other pests are not going away. So we still have all of our other pests, and we're still going to get the pest Kurt is talking about, gold spotted oak borer, not yet in the Bay Area. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be here, whereas for you guys down there, the Mediterranean oak borer, you don't have it yet. I bet you will have it. So let's go to Nara's question, which is, have any municipalities deployed volunteers and community members to scope infested trees? The short answer is yes. It has been done in Orange County through the Master Gardener program that Cooperative Extension runs. And I think that's a better question for Bea Noble-Berman, Dr. Bea Noble-Berman, who runs that program. So I'm not super comfortable with speaking about it because I'm not as familiar with it. I think it has worked, especially for public landscapes and public trees. Then that's as far as I know. Kurt, I don't know if you have any additional info on that.
We do have, several different entities that do a lot of wildland. There's a thing called Canyon Lands, and but they're mostly habitat restoration. That might be a very valuable tool to maybe mention to them to say, hey, maybe you put some eyes on it when you're out. There's also the San Diego River Park Foundation, big organization that, monitors all the San Diego River. That those would be probably great little tools, and it would all have to be, of course, volunteer, because as the saying goes, well, the cynic in me says, well, this pest will be dealt with mildly until it threatens an industry. And then we get some serious funding from the industry that catapults research and all those things, as if we do with, for instance, gold spotted oak borer, glass-winged sharpshooter, sorry about that, and the Xylella complex. That nothing got done there much until they started attacking grapevines, and then the grape growers took notice and coughed up an enormous amount of money because their industry was threatened. So as a landscape pest, we have these things, but I think the reason it's been focused a little bit more with money is because of the broad range of potential hosts. We're not just dealing with a thing on a species. This thing's got a whole bunch of trees it could affect, but it's a very valid thing to assess. So maybe we'll get some volunteers to start keeping eyes on things out in the parks.
I think, Nara, just a kind of comment, is you still want to have a plan for what to do after the pest is found, right? So that's unfortunately part of that, where some of our network members could help with tree replanting, but it's monitoring is the first step. It's not the whole story, right? So kind of, I think we should keep that in mind. There's an interesting question from Dan about are the chemical treatments really effective? So Dan, as far as I know, they are effective on the sort of low severity infestation, moderate severity infestation. They become a lot less effective once you're in the heavy or severe category. But whether they're consistently effective, I don't know. I truly, honestly don't know, because this is the part of the problem. They aren't consistently applied across a range of situations and a range of tree species. They're almost always applied for super high value trees in settings where there's funds to do that. So, your question is valid. If they were applied sort of across the board, would we really see consistent results? And you may be right. Maybe the answer is no. Where they are, the way they are applied in Southern California, they seem to do reasonably well. But again, you're talking about situations where it's a really high value landscape. Think a theme park, right? A theme park or an arboretum or something like that. I'm not naming names, but you can imagine where it's like, no, we have the resources to monitor, we have the resources to apply, we have the resources to kind of do everything right. That's a little bit different from saying this is something everybody can do. Actually, you need approval. And again, you may be right that the results are inconsistent. Alex is pointing out that there's a project on iNaturalist for ISHB detection. I have heard of this too. It's, again, what we're in this really awkward phase where we are getting a whole bunch of false fines, and they're not false fines, they're just fines that aren't ISHB, as Kurt mentioned. So this is going to keep happening for us for a few years. Eventually, we're going to get better at actually recognizing exactly what this thing is, and we still will have other pests that we get confused with ISHB. But at the moment, it's, we probably should get everything confirmed either through the Ag Commissioner's Office or through CDFA, just so we know it's actually happening. I've gotten a report of probably half a dozen fines in the last 6 months that were not ISHB, just where we are. Sarah would like to say something. Go, Sarah.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I have a different perspective on this, being in San Jose. Almost every sample we submit to the Ag Commission comes back positive, be it the actual beetles or wood samples. So, and it's moving into our street tree population. That's where we're really focused because we're, urban foresters, and the riparian corridors can fend for itself. So we're kind of treating this like a forest fire. So removing the amplifier trees as best we can as budget allows, and then using the chemical treatments to establish a perimeter, a 1 mile perimeter around our riparian corridors as kind of a fire break. So hopefully it's not spreading into the rest of the city. But at the same time, we're starting to look at doing transect sampling out from the riparian corridors to figure out where our actual edge is. So just FYI.
Right. So the critical difference with Sarah's situation is that San Jose is the epicenter of this infestation. I'm not saying there are not others in the Bay Area that we haven't picked up, but this is a confirmed infestation, and you can see the edges expanding. And so Sarah's efforts, they are super welcome. I think, unfortunately, this is going to continue to happen. And at least some of the evidence from Southern California suggests that, yeah, a bunch of our trees are susceptible, so we're going to see further damage. I'm just saying that in a slightly larger picture, we shouldn't assume that every single situation that looks like it is ISHB. Eventually it will be. Eventually it really will be that way. But at the moment we're still dealing with all the old pests as well. And there's a couple of questions. Are there any studies to genetically modify the fungus? Actually, yes. I don't think it's genetically modifying the fungus, but it's finding a different fungus that outcompetes the fungus that the beetles eat. So there is a study on biological control on that. And then there's a question of, are some tree species doing better with chemical treatments than others? I don't know. And I again think it's one of these issues where chemical treatments are not applied really across the board. I think maybe Kurt has experience with that.
The one thing to say about it is, of course, the limitation is all those wildlands, you've got basic prohibition of using toxic long-term pesticides to, contaminate the watershed. So that's going to limit its use, at least in those areas. And I applaud Sarah and her group for pouncing on them when they find them there in San Jose. And for you guys, the one thing is, we average 10 inches annual rainfall here. San Jose, you 30, 35. It makes it
18.
Something like that. Somewhere in that range.
18, I think. But it's still double where you are. Yeah, it's still double.
It's double ours anyway. So yeah, for you, restriction to riparian corridors might not apply. And so, yeah, for you to cast a wider net, I think that's a really smart thing to do. Just to, you're in triage, and you know, you can pounce them and snuff them out. Maybe you can prevent a big spread if everybody keeps their eyes on it.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time today. I want to just say thank you so much to Igor and to Kurt for your time and your expertise in sharing with us. Like I mentioned earlier, we will be sharing the recording with you all later this week, so keep your eyes out for it. And in the chat, I am going to put California ReLeaf's website as well as our e-newsletter that you can sign up for, so you can stay informed about upcoming webinars and information regarding various things involving the urban forest. So thank you very much again to our speakers. I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. And thanks so much for being here. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.